for now almost 17 years. And before that, as I was just telling some people, I also did some ceramic sculptures and some pottery and other things.
Is this yours?
Yeah.
So,
Sorry.
I have put together a poster here that you can look at a later time that shows some of the tools that are used to make these wood sculptures, and also shows this particular piece of wood sculpture here from the beginning all the way until the point it is here. So you can sort of see how we create a piece, and also I put some dates on the pictures so you can see how long it takes working on these things. So the reason I got into wood sculpture was actually my wife and I were going to open studios, which it turns out these are the weeks for open studios right now, a number of years ago. In fact, before we had children, we had lots and lots of time on our hands. And one of the places we came across was Ruth Waters' studio at that time it was in Belmont, and now it's been moved up to Burlingame. And she did wood sculpture and taught wood sculpture, and also had a class that you could go to on Wednesday nights. Unfortunately, at that time I was busy on Wednesday nights with another activity. So it took another year or two before I was finally able to push that activity to another night and join this class with Ruth. And I've been taking that class ever since. In fact, I started taking it just before our son was born. And Narelle, my wife, thought that I was going to sort of take it for the summer. And now 17 years have gone by and I'm still stuck in that class. In fact, it's sort of funny because my son, who is now almost 17, who's a junior in high school, one night we were eating dinner and I said, "Oh, I'm going off tonight." And he goes, "Oh, where are you going?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to wood carving. I've been doing this since before you were born. You should know by now." But, for them, they don't really pay attention to the times as much. Anyways, everything that I have learned in wood carving is really come from Ruth. She's really is a fantastic wood carver. She's also the founder and I think director of the Peninsula Museum of Art, which is up in Burlingame. So she's really a special person. And also one of my colleagues, Ted, who's also in the class, and he's been doing it for a mere 8 years, even though his mother, I think, was also a sculptor, so he actually has it in his blood. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. So I don't know if you can see this. You'll have to come over at a later time. Here I show in the upper left my actually carving. Now this is a manual process. This is not something that's done with a lot of mechanical tools or chainsaws or anything like that. Yes, indeed, somebody cuts down a tree for us and we start with there, and they usually start with a chainsaw. But at that process, we use pretty much the same kind of techniques that were used for hundreds, if not thousands of years to make sculptures. And so it's pretty much a mallet, a wooden mallet, and I have a picture of this, and a chisel, and we carve away on the piece. So we start with a log that is pretty much the way I do it is the largest log that I can still lift. And that comes out to about 200 pounds. Wow. Now, I can't lift it and walk it around, but we can roll it or we can do whatever we need to get it in place. So for example, this piece right here weighed at least 200 pounds when I start off with it. Now I can lift it because I've carved enough of the piece off that it's down to maybe 50 pounds or something like that, which is still heavy, but fortunately I'm young enough that I can still move those things around. Now Ruth, she'll actually carve a piece that starts out as 500 or 1,000 pounds, and even when it's done, it's a few hundred pounds. And that's quite a different situation, because if you look over here, you can see what I like to do, and you can see all the pictures, is stand the piece up like this. Normally when we're carving, we don't carve in this kind of situation. It's on its side, and then we carve it and rotate the piece and stuff. If the piece is too heavy, you can't even stand it up to look at it. So we can't even see what it looks like in process. So you really have to have a good eye if you want to carve a piece that's basically lying down and you never see it until it's done. In any case, we spent much time using the hammer and chisel and finally getting a pretty finished shape. But if you ran your hands over it, it would still be a very rough shape, because the chisels can't give you a fine surface like this that's very flat. So at that point, we have to move to a few other tools, which I've listed over here, things called Sureforms and rasps and rifflers. They're all different types of files and things. And with that, we can sort of file it down to a closer shape, so it's nearly the finished shape that you see right here. And then finally, we can move on to sandpaper. So if you look at the dates on here, for example, what you'll see is I started this particular piece on January 17th, 2018, and by the time it was nearly completed, it was April 25th. So this particular piece took me pretty much from January through April, so 4 months or so to make. However, if you look at the last picture, it says April 20th, 2019, so nearly a year went by before I had finally finished sanding it. Now, in part that's because sanding is a slow process, but more importantly, it's not really the fun part of making these sculptures, because when you're carving away, you're creating, you're changing, you're seeing the wood change. But when you're sanding, all you're doing is getting rid of the fine scratch marks on the piece, and it takes a long time, and it's very hard to be motivated. In fact, I always remember what Ruth said, that she wouldn't allow herself to start a new piece if she had 4 pieces that were still unfinished. Was that the number, or 3? Yep. So, unfortunately, I have 3 or 4 pieces in my garage right now that are unfinished, but I am still starting new pieces, so I don't know if I'll get those done.
You hide them from me.
Yeah. So, now, wood sculpture is very different than painting for a number of reasons. Obviously, it's a 3-dimensional art as opposed to a 2-dimensional art, which means you can walk around it and see it from all angles. Okay, and that's not something you can see with paintings. And so we've tried to move these pieces away from the wall. So at least, even if you have a walker or something, you can't get behind it, at least look from the sides, the 2 different sides at the pieces to see what they're like. But there's a lot of other things that are different. This particular type of sculpture is called a subtractive sculpture. So if I'm carving away and I cut his head off, that's it. Now in some cases you can glue things back together, but you can't kind of come back. You can't sort of want to change things. So you really have to know what you're doing. Now it's a pretty slow process, so you tend to realize you're making a mistake fairly quickly before you've done too much damage. That's the hope. But that's a big difference. Another difference is you don't start with this beautiful canvas that's pure white and pristine and completely, unadorned. You start with a real live piece of wood. And every piece of wood is completely different. I mean, as you can see, we have light woods like this ash right here. We have woods that have a dark and a light, like the acacia. We have dark woods like this one here, which is an apricot, or this black walnut. So they start very different. But they also have their own characteristics. The piece that was in the far corner over there that you saw had kind of a weaving shape, and I tried to take advantage of this. The piece that's over in this place had a big part taken out of it that was sort of spiraling, and I tried to take advantage of that also. So we have to start with what we've got. Now, I mean, maybe in old days you could go around to any grove and cut down, the best tree or something, but we don't cut down trees to make this. Now, this is one of the few places where you can't start by buying something on Amazon. You can't buy a piece of wood, a log of wood. You can't go to a store and buy a log of wood. So where do we get the wood? Well, it's typically stuff that's cut down, and it's cut down locally. I'm not driving up to Oregon or something like that to get it. I may be driving up to Atherton or something, but not very far. And so why are these pieces of wood cut down? Well, sometimes they cut them down because there's some new construction and they just want to eliminate, a tree that was in place. But mostly those trees, people try to keep those trees if they're big trees. So instead, most trees are cut down because they're old, I'm sorry to say, and diseased, okay? And not bearing fruit if they're fruit-bearing trees, or no longer, structurally sound, or diseased, or full of termites. And so that's the kind of wood that we oftentimes start with. So the first thing we have to do is when you get a piece of wood is to look at it and try and find out where the problems are, and sometimes cut those pieces are. Sometimes we have to discard a piece that looked like a wonderful piece because as we carve into it, we find that there's disease or termites or something like that in the piece. And as you'll see, there's a picture over here of a tree that was cut down right next to Ted's house in Atherton. He called us up and he had us all go over there. This was a massive black walnut tree that was at least probably 100, 150 years old. Okay, most fruit trees, so, I forgot to mention that this is all these are all hardwoods, okay? So hardwoods, there's typically hardwoods and softwoods. Softwoods are things like redwood trees and pine trees and cottonwoods and the ones, and they really are soft. If you took your fingernail into a piece of wood, you know, underneath the bark is always soft, but if you took the bark off, and you can actually scratch it with your fingernail. If you can do that, you know it's a softwood. If you can't, it's likely a hardwood. And so the kind of hardwoods that are around here are typically fruit trees. And so, as I said, like apricot trees, there's pear, there's apple, but we're not really charging it. Cherry, that? I've got it listed all over there.
What is that wood?
Walnut. That one is probably acacia, which is not a fruit tree, is it? I don't think it's fruit tree. So there's a few that we use that aren't. This one is olive, I think, which I'm not sure if that's considered a fruit tree. I don't really think so. But so going back to the story, Ted said they're cutting down this massive tree. The last thing I was going to say, many fruit trees only live 20 to 100 years. Apricot trees, you know, usually they have to turn the apricot orchards over every 20 to 40 years because the trees have gotten too large. I mean, they've gotten too old and they stopped producing and they're pretty much dying. But black walnuts live a little longer, and this one had gotten so large, we were going to try and harvest from it. So I went over there, and as they were cutting it down, we got the people with the chainsaws to cut, you know, various slabs for us and stuff. And in fact, this tree that he got, this particular piece came from it, and also the one that's kind of around the corner, that also came from it. And so it was really great that we were able to get those because it was a substantial tree. In fact, if you see over there, just the base of it, we estimated weighed about 10,000 pounds. So it would be nice to carve something like that, but obviously there's no way. you couldn't move it. In fact, even pieces that would have a 2-foot diameter were so heavy that we couldn't even budge them. So we had to sadly leave those pieces. So let me talk about a few other things. I also had to build the pedestals. I think you can buy pedestals, but they're pretty darn expensive, and they're sort of, you know, not meant for, you know, for art displays as much. And so you can see I even have a picture of that. Now, one thing that you may notice, you know, through antiquity, many of the things that we have come down to us are actually marble sculptures, okay? So there's marble sculptures, there's also bronze and other metal sculptures, and there's wood sculptures. So the marble sculptures have the great advantage that they could be placed outside and survive the weather. Now these wooden sculptures can't, you know, the rain, obviously trees grow outside, but once we've removed the bark and everything from them, the sun would cause these things to decay, the termites would take over. So these are really inside things. And the metal sculptures have by and large not survived from antiquity because they have been melted down to make cannons and various things like that over the years. So there's very few of them. Let's see, what was I going to say about these? Anyways, so this is the wood sculpture. And one thing, I have a small advertisement over there. The elementary school that my children went to wanted me to build a sign for them. And the name of their school is Almond Elementary, and their mascot is the Almond Eagle. And so it had to be an outdoor sign, and I wanted to make a sculpture, but I couldn't make it out of wood. I mean, I guess I could have painted it and put a lot of finish on it. But instead I made a mosaic sign, which is a whole other thing. But that's actually out there. I've given the address. If you ever want to drive around Los Altos, you can see what it looks like. So does anybody have any questions? I can talk about some more of the pieces or the woods or the carving process or anything.
I have a question.
Yes.
You start out with a log. How do you decide what you're going to make out of it?
Somebody speaking, could you please be quiet to let the speaker be heard? Thank you.
Yes, no, that's a good question.
Why don't you repeat it?
Yes.
He was asking a question.
Yeah, he was just asking a question. He wanted to know, how do I decide what to make out of the piece? Well, when you have a canvas, if you're a painter, how do you decide what to paint? Okay, now, we're typically pretty much constrained, as I say. Sometimes the piece of wood has a kind of a shape, and when I look at that shape, I say, I see something, something in it. In this particular piece, for example, as you can see over there, there were some problems in the thing, and I knew I was going to have to cut this part out because I think there was a large knot here. And in fact, there's a piece around the corner that is kind of what I call sort of my primitive man, and he has a big eye. And the first thing I had to do, in that case, there was definitely a knot, so a branch had come out of that place. The branch had come off and had rotted away, so the wood was actually bad there. So the first thing I had to do was cut that knot out, cut that hole, and then when I saw that, I said, oh, it looks like an eye, and I kind of moved on from there. So that's sort of how I've come up with these shapes, but it's sort of an artistic thing. Any other questions? Yes?
How heavy is the piece around the corner?
All of these
Right there, the one I can see half of it, yeah.
with the
big
head?
one, the big one.
That one's also in the range of 40 to 50 pounds. We don't actually, I don't weigh these pieces or anything
No, I
like
was just
that.
wondering.
The lighter ones, the smaller ones are maybe, that one is probably the lightest. It's about 20 pounds, 15 pounds, 30, 50, etc. So.
Another thing, how do you preserve it after you've done it?
Ah, that's a good point. Exactly. So I forgot to mention this. So once I have finished sanding the piece down so it's very smooth, it kind of, the wood doesn't look as beautiful as this. This is kind of the look of a wet wood. So what you do is you put on, we use a linseed oil, so you put that on, and it's equivalent to kind of wetting the wood, and it brings the color of the wood out. So up until then, if you have a chance to look at this later, you'll see it's kind of a duller, it's not as dark a look at this, even though the pictures don't do it justice. And so you put the linseed oil on. Sometimes you put one coat, sometimes two coats. In some cases, I think with the apricot woods, as many as 7 coats on. And then finally, once that's all dried and stuff, then we usually put a wax on that just sort of repels the dust and protects it. And that reminds me of something. You can see, you can touch these pieces. This is another thing that's different than a painting. If you put your hand on a painting, the oils from your hand, you could scratch the piece, the oils could do something bad to it. But these pieces, this is wood. This is like the armrest of a chair or something. It's meant to actually be felt. And you can touch it, you can stroke it, but do so lovingly, okay? The biggest problem with this is knocking them over, okay? So you can knock the piece over, you can even knock the pedestals over, so please be careful. But otherwise, feel free to feel them. It's a kinesthetic thing also. You can feel how the surfaces feel. Yes?
Okay. Are these now completely sealed that no termites will get into it? Is it
Well,
completely sealed?
Typically, when you're inside a situation like this, the termites aren't here. If I put them outside, the termites would get to them.
Is this completely sealed now?
I'm not sure. I think it's sealed against things like rot and decay. Now, if it gets wet, it could eventually mildew or something like that. But there are wood sculptures that go back, I think, hundreds or thousands of years that have survived, but they've been inside.
Okay.
So, yes.
Are there any woods that are so hard to chisel that you just don't use them?
That's a good question. There are woods that are so hard, that are so heavy, in fact. You know how you normally think of boats and everything that wood floats? Well, some woods are so dense that they'll actually sink in water. But they're not that they are very hard, but I think the chisels, steel is still very strong. Ruth, do you have any experience with that?
Ebony, lignum vitae, and Brazilian rosewood. They're all like 25 pounds the cubic foot, and they would sink. But you can carve them,
You can carve them.
and they're beautiful.
Because we are still using metal tools, and the metal tools are pretty. But that's interesting.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay. Have you entered any juried shows?
I have not. There are some shows. Some of my colleagues that have gone through this class used to submit their sculptures to the San Mateo County Fair, and they would get judged there, and they would get ribbons and things like that. But I haven't.
Have you put your sculpture in any gallery for sale?
I have done open studios, so I have displayed them and everything like that, but they are not in any galleries at this point.
That's what I was gonna say. What do you do when you're finished with all these beautiful pieces? You have to have a major house to keep it.
I know. Yeah. Fortunately, it takes a long enough time to create each of these pieces. I can maybe create 2 pieces a year. So it takes many years before I get a lot, but I have gotten to the critical mass stage, and I am thankful that I can place some of them here so I can have a little room left in my office at home.
I want to put in a plug for the
Wait one
outside
second.
the Tavrow's
Oh.
apartment on the 4th floor. There is a magnificent piece of leaves, and you almost cannot not touch it. It's like begging to be stroked. And so I invite you all to the 4th floor, Elmire.
I've seen.
What were you saying, Dan? Oh, yes. Go ahead and then I'll get you.
I was just curious, have you ever titled any of these, even though there's no indication on the
Ruth
pencil?
is always asking me to title pieces, and she titles her pieces, and I appreciate that. And I always think in my mind about titles when you sometimes go to a museum and it's called Anonymous 12 or something. I'm thinking, is that a title?
Well, untitled.
I was thinking of calling this particular piece right here, let's see, it's all in the genes. Because people had suggested to me when I was building it that this is kind of like the double helix, because it's sort of wrapping around. And then at the bottom, I hope you'll have a chance to come over and look at this more closely. Yeah. I have what I call the female leg and shoe facing one direction, and a male sort of boot and everything facing the other direction. And so it's kind of a different way of thinking about it. One thing that I should mention, though, is that lately, in some of my more recent pieces, like this one and the one around the corner, I've tried to add sort of humor into my pieces. If you look at a piece like this, there's no real humor. I think it's a beautiful piece. I hope you do too. But this one, where I have sort of the man and woman in the opposite direction, so I, tried to do that more recently. Was there?
Well, when I saw the one around the corner, it reminded me of some of the New Guinea carvings. Was there any bit of that in there, or it just happened?
Well, my parents, she was just saying when the piece around the corner, which is very difficult to see from over here, but hopefully you'll have a chance later to walk around and see it, reminded her of some New Guinea, or I would say African carvings. And I, in fact, if I have a title for that one, it would be called Primitive Man. And my parents do have some African sculptures because they were in Africa, and one of my sisters actually worked in Africa. I think you might have heard her speak a month or 2 ago or so. And so, she's always been interested in that. And it does have some characteristics of that. So I have tried to sort of duplicate some of the things. One thing I think is very funny about that piece, once again, in my, maybe this is my warped sense of humor, but normally, we think of a person is, symmetric. They have 2 arms and 2 legs and 2 eyes and 2 nostrils and 2 everything. But if you'll look at this closely, you'll see it only has 1 of everything. Okay? It only has 1 arm and it has 1 hand. It doesn't have all the fingers. So I've kind of tried to simplify a lot of things, on that particular piece. So sorry. No problem.
It's on my way to where I live.
Yes.
How do you pass on the works through the
Was that part of the exhibit?
I like the working space.
They're not. Now, what happens is a piece, what they are, they're slightly fastened with something called museum museum putty. Okay, and it's kind of like silly putty, if you know that, or clay. And if you put that down, it'll actually make a pretty good bond, but I can still lift it off of it. Now, most of the pieces I have tried to make so that they'll actually stand on their own. This particular piece wouldn't stand on its own, so it actually has a base that I had to make, and the base sits on the pedestal, and it is actually screwed in to the base. So that's the way that this one happens to be, but this is the only one I think in this grouping that actually has a base. So, yes?
What tools do you use?
Well, as you can see, I try to show some of them in the pictures over there, but it's the mallet and chisel are the main tools, and then we have all these different types of files and rasps and rifflers and various things like that to do the finishing on it, and then finally the sandpaper and stuff. And you can see, one thing that I've shown is that I tend to use one glove because I'm holding a chisel with my right hand. I happen to be left-handed, so I hold the chisel with my right hand, I hold the mallet with my left hand, and I bang. Now, if I'm not paying attention or if I slip, I tend to hit my hand or something happens. So it tends to protect my hand. I know a lot of people, some people use 2 gloves, some people use no gloves, but you can see that I've shown sort of a new one versus one over there that I've used for quite a while, and so I'm trying to hope that I preserve my hand a little bit in doing that. So, any other questions on this? Yes?
I've never asked you this, being around you for all these 17 years. Martin, do you start with a drawing, or do you just start chiseling?
No, that's a great great question, because there's obviously many different ways to do this. I tend to look at the piece of wood. I have maybe an idea. I want to make something figurative, or I want to make something that's completely abstract like this one beforehand. And then I look at the wood and see if I can fit it in there, and maybe I'll say, I'm not going to use that piece, I'm going to use a different piece or something like that. But then I kind of have an idea in my mind, and I use a piece of chalk. You'll see the chalk marks when you look at the poster there, and I kind of chalk in what it is. Sometimes I'll build what's called a maquette, or just a little model, using a modeling clay or something like that, to get something right. So, so I can at least play around with that a little bit. I know Ted, who's also in the class, he is just the opposite. He likes to build a complete maquette for the piece and then go from that, which is perfectly fine. It's just a different approach. My approach is more to sort of follow where the wood is taking me. Oftentimes, for example, when I was making this piece, I sort of started from the top and I was working down, and as I realized that I could put these feet on, that the feet were not the original idea of the piece, but they came to me as I was working through the piece. And so I tended to try and take advantage of the time I spend with the piece to try and make it more interesting and things like that.
There's food.
Oh.
Maybe you can mention that there were refreshments.
Yeah, no, I've talked for about half an hour. If anybody else has any other questions about the woods, or let me just say one other thing. One thing that's very interesting about the woods is, and you can see it like on this, there's usually lines in the wood, and sometimes it's called the grain of the wood or the figuration of the wood. So if you take a log or a tree and you cut it and look down, you can count the tree rings on it and everything like that. And the reason that there are tree rings is because in the summer the tree is growing very quickly, and in the winter it grows very slowly, and so the change in that growth causes usually a change in color, which is why you see these things. And so all of the trees have it. Some have it where you can barely see it, and some where you can't see it at all. Some of them that have it very strongly, you have to carve something that's very simple, because if you carved a complicated design that's something that already has all this complicated stuff going on, it wouldn't be very enjoyable to look at the piece. If you have a piece that's extremely flat, it has no variation, then you can put more detail into it. Another thing that happens is the wood, in addition to that, typically has a heartwood, which is the center of the wood, and the sapwood, which is the outside of the wood, right up against the bark. Remember, we removed the bark. And so the sapwood in most woods is lighter, and the hardwood is darker. Now, in some woods like this one, there's a significant difference between the two, and you can take advantage of that. So that's another thing that you can do with the wood.
But what oak, did you say this is oak?
No, this is an
what did you say it was?
acacia.
Acacia.
This is acacia.
Okay, I forgot what you said.
I think.
Yeah.
Sometimes we don't know what
I
these
don't know
woods
what
are.
oak looks like when it's
Yeah.
all carved, I don't know.
Yeah, most books, as Ruth has always lamented, most books that talk about trees show the trees from the outside, but, with the leaves and the fruits and the branches and everything. But when we get them, oftentimes sometimes the bark is even fallen off of them, and we're just looking at the wood, and none of those books are going to help us at all. So, any other questions? Or?
Are they for sale?
I guess they're for sale. I mean, my purpose in bringing them here is not to try to sell them. But if people want to buy them, they could. They're expensive because, as you can imagine, each of these pieces takes me tens of hours, some as much as 50 hours in order to make. So even if I charge $10 an hour, that's $500, and I would charge more than that for these pieces. So they would be in the thousands of dollars. So if you really want to buy one of these pieces, be prepared to pay, thousands of dollars.
Very well said. Very well said.
Yes.
Blind people would absolutely go crazy with your pieces because they could touch them and feel the curvatures and everything.
Yes.
My mother used to love to go to the Stanford, who was blind, to go to the Stanford garden with all the things. It's one of the few places she could touch things. And she'd spend hours touching things, and particularly at Hell's Gate, people would get a little upset, but she wasn't allowed to move.
Right.
But I thought of her when I see some of these sculptures.
Yes. No, I think it's great to be able to touch these pieces, and I will say that Ted is the absolute master at making pieces that are absolutely perfect in the outside. Mine, unfortunately, you'll see, are not quite as perfect. And Ruth, I really appreciate Ruth. Ruth makes very large pieces. She makes small pieces too, but some pieces she has she has a piece that's I think 10 feet tall. She can't even stand it upright in her studio. And she feels that, a piece that's absolutely perfect sometimes seems like it's mechanically made or made by a machine, but to show, it's nice sometimes to leave a few imperfections. So I remind myself of that when I can't quite get something exactly right.
This is your hobby, only?
Yes, this is my hobby. Yes, and you can read my artist statement. I'm actually an engineer. I design computer chips. And so this is one of the things that I enjoy doing in my spare time. So.
Is there any type of wood you avoid? Like eucalyptus tends to split and warp.
There are definitely woods that are a problem. Ruth has some experiences with some woods that will actually give you rashes. Like you don't want to use a camphor tree, I think, isn't that true?
They laurel too.
Yeah. So fortunately, we have an expert, so we don't have to learn the hard way. She can tell us, no, don't do that, or so she's the repository of much of the knowledge.
This is so wonderful.
Thank you.